Welcome to this second lecture in Introduction to Biblical Cosmology. In the last lecture, we explored hermeneutics, and we hopefully developed our own personal understanding of what the lens is that we bring to reality, to life more broadly, and to Scripture. And so in this lecture, we're going to then begin going backwards in time in a history of ideas type of approach, going through and looking at, for today, the etiology and features of the modern cosmological worldview. Etiology just means the origins of things. It's a word you use in academia to discuss analyzing where things come from and what causes them. I've used a phrase there, modern cosmological worldview, and I think I should define my terms with you so that we can have a shared understanding of what I mean by those. With modern, what I mean is the period from the Enlightenment onward and everything that goes along with that. The word modern can have a lot of particular, unique applications and meanings in different fields. I'm not using it in those bespoke ways. I'm really just using it the most generically way you can to mean really since, let's say, the 18th century onward. How have people looked at the cosmos, looked at the vastness of space, of reality? How have they understood that during that time? And that's what I mean by cosmological. With cosmological, I mean the basic beliefs about the nature and origin of the cosmos that tend to be the shared default setting within a culture or indeed within a civilization. And by worldview, I mean the basic mental model of reality that a person or a group of people, a society even, you might say, has. So, and worldview is important. It sits underneath beliefs and ideology. Most people don't excavate the archaeological remains of the worldview that they inherited when they were children or when they were young. It tends to remain unexamined with most people. And that worldview that they have will then be the basis for the values that they have, what they think are right and wrong or good and bad, the ideologies that might appeal to them. Those will ultimately rest upon the worldview that the person has. It's usually inherited and absorbed in early life, and indeed I think it's why you could say that whoever controls the classrooms controls the world. Now, my personal academic background is in history, and particularly in history education. So I was a high school history teacher for a long time. I then moved into the tertiary sector. I did my PhD in history curriculum, looking at how teachers teach history, let's say. And so therefore, from all of my training, I've been trained to think historically. And I tend to, when we're studying these topics, I tend to use things called the historical concepts, or sometimes called historical thinking. It's a framework for looking at history where you look for cause and effect, change over time, how significant things are. You can look it up if you're interested, but just to be totally transparent with you, that does frame how I think about these things. So you'll find that there's a history of ideas approach to how I do things, and that's done on purpose because ultimately we're trying to understand how better we think about reality in the cosmos, and ultimately, of course, biblically, how the Bible writers, the Second Temple period writers of the biblical texts, how did they look at reality? That's what we're trying to get into. And so hopefully it'll work. Let's see. So when a historian wants to understand a historical period, a good historian will usually look at the period before to see what caused the features, the characteristics, the trends, and the change over time of the period that they're looking at. So this moves beyond then just describing features of a historical period to instead truly understanding where that period came from. Indeed, I find that there are parallels with the trend we see with therapy that people go through these days. I thought this was a useful analogy, where when people go to therapy, very often it'll end up that they'll end up talking about things that happened to them in their earliest years, usually in their childhood, and it'll be about sort of recovering that, rediscovering it, analysing it, looking at it, and then that helps them to understand why they are how they are, and perhaps also why their family milieu is the way that it was. It's generally speaking. We're not doing therapy here, we're doing history, but there are strong parallels, because if we want to understand the modern worldview, the case I'm going to make to you and what we're going to do in this lecture is I'm really going to be focusing on the transition from the medieval to the modern. Why did that happen? What was driving that? What was motivating it? And I think it'll help us understand modernity better. And to do that, we're going to start all the way back in the 1300s. So let's start by outlining the medieval worldview. Now, this will be very brief. We will be looking at the medieval worldview in the next lecture in detail. Broadly speaking, generally speaking, the medieval worldview was a stable worldview. It was a stable, totalizing worldview based upon, like you could argue, based upon something known as the Great Chain of Being. So what had emerged by the High Middle Ages was a way of looking at the cosmos in which people saw a hierarchically ordered cosmic system governed by God the Creator, the Christian God. I'm talking about, in Western Europe. We've talked about this in the last lecture. I'll be mainly focusing on Western Europe through this. In other subjects, we might extend our investigations to other civilizations. And so God the Creator at the top, and then there's sort of a pyramid, if you like, a great chain of being down from the Creator, moving towards down towards the infernal regions. You sort of your Dante circles of hell type place. And so this reached its apogee, its high point, with Thomas Aquinas in the Latin West. Thomas Aquinas put together something that's known as the scholastic method. And the scholastic method, I think you could argue, is the foundation for modern scholarship. The protocols and procedures of modern scholarship, I think you could say, ultimately derive from what was put together there by Thomas Aquinas. What Aquinas was trying to do was to reconcile faith and reason. And he believed he had achieved that by ultimately saying that you can better know God from nature, and you can apply reason to deepen your understanding of God. And so there doesn't need to be an antipathy between the two. That was Aquinas' take. And interestingly enough, though, Aquinas, in seeking to reconcile faith and reason, he ultimately laid the foundation for the triumph of secular reason in academia and scholarship, and ultimately in Western civilization itself. So by the 18th century, so this is centuries after Aquinas, by the 18th century, the medieval worldview that I just described had largely fallen apart. It had fallen away, particularly among European elites. And in this lecture, we're going to look at how and why. So let's go back to the 14th century. Now, just the century before the 13th century is generally called by scholars the High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages is the stereotype of the Middle Ages: big castles, chivalry, jousting, all those sorts of things. That's the 1200s, and it was a period of flourishing across Europe. The 14th century, though, it was essentially the breakdown of the medieval world that had built up. And the 14th century, the 1300s, was a period of crisis not seen in 1800 years in Europe. Like in the 13th century, the tallest building in the world shifted from the Great Pyramid of Giza to Lincoln Cathedral over there in Lincoln in England. And Lincoln Cathedral remained the tallest building for a couple of centuries before, I think it was about the 1500s, the top spire fell down and the crown shifted back to the Great Pyramid. But it's quite astonishing to consider that there in Lincoln, in Britain, in England, I guess you could say, that they were able to achieve such a remarkable feat. And indeed, a lot of the great cathedrals, the great pyramids that people go into Europe to see, were built around the High Middle Ages. That world of prosperity, a very wealthy elite who owned the land, and all of that sort of stuff with peasants and serfs and whatnot, that world began to fall apart, starting with, really, you could say, in 1315 to 1317, an event known as the Great Famine, which killed up to 10% of the population of Europe. Then in 1337 to 1453, there was the 100 Years' War, which devastated France in particular, but economically devastated much of Western Europe. In 1347 to 1353 was the Black Death, which killed, scholars estimate, between a third and a half of the Europeans left after all of these catastrophes already. And then capping it all off in 1453 was the fall of Constantinople, which was psychologically devastating for Christian Europe. And although it had the effect of leading to Greek intellectual culture spreading westward through Italy. And so that helped to supercharge what we're going to talk about in a second with the Renaissance, where the scholarship which had been held by the Byzantines over there in Constantinople came over to Italy and ultimately promoted, it helped to promote a trend which was already going. The humanist movement in Italy was already started, but those the influence of those intellectuals from Constantinople really gave it wings. And this sequence of catastrophes, it shook the foundations of the stable medieval worldview. And we're going to see this historically. When you go back again and again, you will have periods where civilizationally stable periods will develop civilizationally stable cosmological worldviews. Sorry, there was a lot of unnecessary complexity, but I hope you understood what I meant. And then you will see that when the civilizations of that period ultimately collapse, fall apart, whatever you might say, then the worldview that both supported and was supported by those political structures will also fall apart, begin to weaken and crumble. And that's what happened to the medieval worldview after the crisis of the 14th century. And so the legitimacy of the medieval scholastic worldview was now questionable. No one was going to get too upset, I guess, if you were to challenge the status quo, because the status quo itself had collapsed around people. And so this this went along with a couple of different trends. It went along with the rise of merchant capitalism, and which you might say was driven by the Crusades developing trade routes, and also the beginnings of the development of modern banking in Italy. The development of banking there in Italy, particularly under families like the Medicis in Florence, enabled patronage of the arts and scholarship in ways that it hadn't happened before, and was happening therefore outside the church. So you began to have wealthy elites who could sponsor culture and scholarship, and they weren't members of the Vatican hierarchy. From 1100 onward, we had the founding of universities, and then we also had we saw the rise and the spread of humanism, secular humanism, which really was the beginning of intellectuals breaking with Christianity and Catholic Christianity as the default intellectual setting. Humanism challenged that and was about pushing back against that heritage, and therefore pushing back against the worldview of that heritage. And so we can see that there are 5 trends here that drove this transition from the medieval to the modern. We can see humanism, the development of printing, later on the Reformation, the discovery of the New World, and then the scientific revolution. Each of these resulted in a crisis of authority for elites, the established elites, particularly the church, and the worldview that they maintained. And so let's go through each of these. Humanism is the rejection of that scholastic framing of philosophy and theology that we talked about. And the slogan of the humanists was ad fontes, which is Latin, and it means to the source, back to the origin. And so what the humanist intellectuals were saying was that ultimately Europeans needed to rejuvenate their moribund cultures by going back to Greek and Roman sources of art and literature and whatnot, in order to revive, rejuvenate, and rediscover the glory of that ancient world. They wanted to read ancient texts and investigate natural phenomena directly. So the investigation of the natural world went along with the rediscovery of Greek and Roman ways of thinking. And this philosophical movement ultimately anticipated the religious twin, I think you could argue, the Reformation. But we'll talk about that in a second. And ancient sources and empirical investigation led to a focus more and more on the study of created things instead of on the creator. And we can see where that ultimately led to with the development of material science. These ideas were able to be spread because of the development of printing. And I should acknowledge printing, movable type, wasn't developed in Europe. I believe the Koreans would say that it was developed there. The Chinese would say that it was developed there. I'll leave them to fight that out. But it had been developed for the first time a couple of centuries before in East Asia. However, in Europe, it was introduced around about this time. And The development of movable type assisted the revolt against scholastic hegemony. So when you could just pump out more texts, or at least the same amount of text perhaps, as the monks, as the Vatican elites could, then you're going to win the battle of ideas, because you've just got that productive edge now that you can create texts and distribute them in Latin and also in the vernacular languages that people can read. And this broke the geographical constraints on intellectual culture. The Vatican was the center of intellectual culture because it was a place where intellectuals, ambitious thinkers and philosophers from all over Europe could come together and coordinate ideas and develop frameworks. Once you have movable type, you can have distributed networks of intellectuals, and we see that becomes a very powerful tool. And it enabled the development of a pan-European intellectual elite outside the church. As I mentioned, the corollary of this occurred within Christianity with the Reformation, and Reformation applied these processes of going back to the source to the biblical scriptures themselves, and also distributing those biblical texts in languages that everyday people could read. This might not seem like a big deal to us, but Christians were burned at the stake for translating the Bible into local languages. Men like Wycliffe, Fox's Book of Martyrs goes through this in detail. And that just gave moral credibility to the people who wanted to, let's say, liberate the text for the people of Europe. And this took out the last bastion of the scholastic authority of the church in Northern and Western Europe. It caused tumultuous wars that ultimately exasperated people with this whole question of religion itself, and led to a reaction against theological dogmatism by the 18th century. So because there was so many wars and conflicts and tumult from these religious differences, we can see that people began to develop the shared view that we need to not let religion become dogmatic and lead to these wars anymore. It needs to be sort of constrained, and then we need to be able to operate outside of religious control. We can see this in the rule, for example, of Elizabeth I. She said, "Let us not make windows into men's souls." So trying to end this period of religious dogmatism and violence, it took another century or so before that finally happened. But ultimately, we can see that secular materialism won the day because it's posited itself as not being dogmatic. Whether that's true or not, we could argue in the history of the 20th century, but in the 18th century, that seems to be correct. The discovery of the New World was the geographical manifestation of this trend. So with humanism, we had this trend in philosophy. With the Reformation, we have this trend in religion. With the discovery of the New World, this same trend of upending established orders happens geographically. And the revelation of entire continents and hemispheres that had been unknown discredited the ordered system of the medieval worldview that suddenly seemed very inadequate versus direct observation being promoted by the humanists. All of this leads into the scientific revolution. And so with the scientific revolution, we have the culmination of all of these trends, and it comes to a head in astronomy, which I think is very interesting, given that I'm going to be arguing as we go through these subjects, and just broadly speaking, I'm going to be arguing that I think cosmology, how people look at the cosmos, is the foundation of much of how people think. And it's very interesting that it's in astronomy that all of this contention came to a head, and ultimately it's being able to explain and predict astronomical phenomena came to be seen as more valuable than just having a framework to provide meaning for them. So the focus of European intellectual pursuits came to be explaining and understanding the materium of creation, rather than trying to find any type of meaning for it, at least in the sciences. And this was novel. This was new. People in the medieval and ancient periods hadn't made that separation. And rationalism, the belief that reason and not revelation or tradition is the most robust foundation of knowledge, this emerged from a method of doubting everything until it could be investigated and until it could be proven. And it became the signature method of critique used throughout modernity to deconstruct traditional beliefs, traditional values, traditional lifestyles. It's still going on today. Postmodernists will say that they're doing something new. They're not. Postmodernism is just an extension of modernity, because modernity is critique. It's the rationalist critique of anything held as traditional or customary or metaphysical. And of course, this I would frame it as onslaught. That's probably loaded language, but it was an onslaught. It was a very successful one. This onslaught, of course, ultimately, like Megiddo in the Jewish wars, the last bastion that this came around was, of course, the Bible, and it still is today. Bible scholarship is nothing if not contentious. A binary dualism emerged within the scientific revolution between rationalism and empiricism. Empiricism is it's the view that human reason is faulty and only direct experience is valid. These two are in tension in science all the time. Ultimately, Isaac Newton came along and reconciled rationalism and empiricism with the development of his elegant mathematical laws, and this became the basis of the modern scientific method. It's very interesting too that Isaac Newton spent more of his time in his later years working on theories of biblical eschatology, that's end time stuff, than he did on his physics stuff. But he kept it secret because it was quite heretical at the time. That's just an interesting aside. So our modern worldview, and it's not just a Western one anymore. This worldview is now global. There's this modern worldview. It's mutated over time. It's not fixed. It's not monolithic. It itself mutates over time like all things do, but it retains a core foundation. And the core foundation is a critique of customary, metaphysical, or traditionally held claims, or claims that can't be verified with reference to observable evidence. That is really what holds the modern worldview together. It's a faith in reason applied to data, and it has a materialist orientation to reality because our senses can't sense outside the materium. That's what makes something supernatural, is that our five senses can't, well, when we start to get into theoretical physics and some of the more recent developments in science, then that starts to break down. But that's another topic of conversation. It starts to sound quite familiar to a religious person, some of the stuff that happens in science these days. But this really is what holds modernity together. It's a worldview which is based upon critique and skepticism. Of course, it's been very, very successful at mastering the physical world. We have totally dominated nature. We won the war on nature. And debates within this Western worldview tend to be about how that foundation is to be interpreted, rather than challenging it directly. There is a consensus within modernity that rationalist critique is the core of how humans should understand reality, should approach and interact with reality. This is the worldview which has shaped the cosmological worldview of people in our culture today. So, as I mentioned at the start of this lecture, I would contend that the majority of people today, in the West and of course now globally, I think, they would hold to some form of the Big Bang cosmology if you pressed them. Yeah, most people don't really investigate cosmology, physics, astronomy, these sorts of things. But if you press them and say, "Oh, where does it all come from?" Oh, the Big Bang. And that is held by people because it's the most demonstrable, it's the most provable by most people's lights. That itself is a worldview, and it's a reflection of the modern worldview. And I believe that we can, as we go back through the history of the changes in cosmological worldview over time, then we will see that it's quite a unique worldview, because medieval people and ancient people had categorically different ways of thinking. Their worldviews were categorically different. And in the next lecture, we're going to keep moving backwards in time and look at medieval cosmology. And applying the same approach that we did in this lecture, we're going to look at its development during the late antique period and the collapse of the ancient way of looking at things. That'll be in our next lecture, and I hope to see you then.